Take one.
Around and go closer to the mic and further from the mic, closer to the mic, further from the mic, closer to the mic, further to the mic, and you get that
Right.
because as the sound is coming closer to the mic, it's increasing in
And
frequency,
then it goes away.
and as it goes further from the mic,
Yep.
it's decreasing in frequency. You get this thing spinning at 30 to 150 RPM, and you're getting a lot of slight tonal warble.
I was gonna say I've used a real Leslie cab and I've used a software plugin.
Right.
And although people stand by the plugins, and I respect that, I am a hardware guy. I think Steven and I have had this conversation 10 times.
Me too, of course.
If you ever have a chance to either use a Leslie cab or to use a software effects, and it's definitely go with the hardware.
Yeah, it's a beautiful effect.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like, I don't know, you can't really reproduce a lot of these things. Like they try, and it comes close, but you just, until you're actually there and you can feel it, you can see it. It's an entirely different thing.
The way I kind of interpret it is literally, and it's just something I experience, is the depth of the sound. The sound has a depth to it for some reason, even though the simulation is probably awesome. You know,
I have a very unique pedal here.
Oh yeah.
This is called a Leslie combo amp preamp, and this was a device that would go into a Leslie with the unique plug that a Leslie had, an 8-pin octal plug through a long cord to the Leslie cabinet, and this allowed you to plug in a guitar or a vocal mic or something like that, and by tapping on the buttons, you could increase or slow down the speaker, but you could play a guitar or do a vocal through a Leslie and get the full Leslie effect.
Right. Let me just give an example.
I had several Leslies at Indigo, and we use this a lot.
Sorry about that. Let me give an example for a track that comes to mind immediately. There was a song by Soundgarden called Black Hole Sun. That guitar sound in the beginning is a Leslie. So if you've heard that song or you want to go and hear that song, we're not going to put it on here for you to hear because it's copyrighted material, but
we won't do that.
You can hear that's just a guitar, maybe a couple of other effects in there, but the main effect driving that guitar lick or part is a Leslie.
Well,
and
we use Leslie a lot.
Yeah, it's an awesome.
Even in the heavy metal productions with Ross Robinson, we would use this Leslie combo. We also had another device, which I'll post as a picture, called a Reslie, R-E-S instead of L-E-S. And it was merely a Japanese misinterpretation. Somebody said, oh, we've got this electronic device that sort of simulates a Leslie, and somehow or another it made it into actual production without anybody catching the error that the guy had said it's a Leslie, and in Japanese it's like, it's a Reslie. And it got into production.
Or they didn't want to get sued by Leslie, so they just changed it.
Shanae Reslie effects box, and we use that considerably on the heavy metal stuff to get that warbling Doppler type effect.
All right, so you got the Leslie, and you're loading in the Hammond and the Leslie for Neil Young.
Oh, we're back to Neil. After he's done with the drums, he goes to the Leslie, to the Hammond organ, a B3 Hammond organ, which was their more famous popular rock and roll organ, plugged into a Leslie cabinet, and we recorded all the Leslie parts for Will to Love, which is kind of the main instrument going in the background of the guitar and vocal.
No click track, no...
Oh, no, this was recorded on a cassette player in front of a campfire.
Exactly.
But Neil is a feel type of player rather than a click track type of player. And he could feel, as he played the parts, both the drum fill and the organ parts, just exactly what was going to fit. Always simplistic in what he played, worked with the track rather than became some sort of techie fancy overdub.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then when he was done with that, we went on to this huge pile of rented percussion equipment. And we did some chimes and some gongs and some bells and stuff like that, which again, Neil played himself. He was virtually a good enough master at every imaginable instrument to play these parts. Mm-hmm. And that ended up being the final parts for Will to Love. And then Will to Love came out as an album, and David called me and said, Will to Love has hit the market on American Stars and Bars, and it's doing fabulously well. Fans are loving it, especially Like a Hurricane, mm-hmm. and the song I did, Will to Love. And he said, look for something from your UPS man pretty soon. And sure enough, shortly thereafter, in the mail, UPS, comes and we'll post this separately also, my gold record for American Stars and Bars. American Stars and Bars was my first ever gold album. Yeah. Now, I've got a wall full of gold albums now, as you guys know, but American Stars and Bars was my very first one, and I would say that I unloaded that album. I was just starting to work on the Moody Blues Octave album.
I think that's right behind you. That platinum record is right behind you.
Yeah, that one.
Yeah, that's it.
And the Moody Blues had recorded most of the basic tracks at the record plant. They were sort of having an internal personnel war, mm-hmm. and
difference of opinion.
and right. Then one of the guys was walking through the record plant, and a brick fell from
what?
Record plant. There was some brick ledges, and a brick fell, and I don't know if it hit one of the guys or nicked him or what, but it made them decide that we don't want to be here anymore. So the brick had fallen and nearly wounded one of the guys. I can't remember who it was, as I always make the same disclaimer in all of these podcasts, mm-hmm. that it's
subtle
part fact and part fiction, and running on some memories, many of which are 35 years or more old. Yeah. And this is one of those, since that album is definitely in the 35-year class. Mm-hmm. And they decided to come to Mike Pinder's studio, which had always been affectionately known as the Moody Blues Studio. Mm-hmm. And they decided, well, let's give Mike's place a try. And they came in, and they got as their engineer, famous engineer Chris Brunt, who had been doing a lot of the albums at Indigo Ranch. And I had been working on virtually every album that happened, oftentimes as the engineer or whatever, but I hadn't gotten the, what shall we say, client list necessary to jump in and do a Moody Blues album. And they show up right after the UPS guy. I open the package, and inside there's a gold record from Neil Young. And the guys in the Moody Blues sort of looked at it like Neil Young was one of their heroes. And they said, oh, wow, you did that? Oh, well, Richard, let's get you in on some of this. And at the end of a few weeks, Chris Brunt was getting wary of doing the all-night kind of sessions that they were often demanding. And he said, I'm just not into this anymore. And he said, let's put Richard in, front center in the driver's seat as the main engineer. And I finished recording the album with them, and I had to gain their trust. And I remember doing a lot of things with them and slowly gaining their trust, picking out nice pieces of equipment for them to use and nice amps and stuff like that. I remember I had, this will come out in a Moody Blues podcast, but I brought out my personal guitar amp that I had had since I was in high school for Justin Hayward to use as the solo amp on Top Rank Suite from the Octave album, and I had their hearts at that point. But that was my first gold album, and I think it contributed to my acceptance in the studio considerably after that. And then suddenly I have a platinum album from the Moody Blues, and then a couple more Neil Young ones, and then a number of other artists that I had been working on in the ensuing year or two. And I'm starting to fill up a little wall full of gold and platinum albums, and was accepted. I didn't go through any of the recording schools or anything like that, so I was basically flying by the seat of my pants. But
sounds like it.
I was
like it.
had just sort of a knack for it, and ended up getting accolades from everybody that I work with, and them wanting me back again. So it was repeat clients over and over again.
Right.
Now, with Neil, that album came out, and I got the gold album for it. And shortly after that, the original trilogy that I had done on that very first night of recording started to appear, and then another song that I did early in that career appeared on the very famous Decade album. And what Decade was is exactly what it sounds like, a decade, 10 years. It was the first 10 years of Neil Young's career, where he put his favorite songs from that first decade on what was then, I think, a 2-album set.
It had four sides, I think. Yeah.
And he only included 3 previously unreleased songs. The rest of them were like from Gold Rush or after the Gold Rush, and from other famous Neil Young discs that had been done up to then. But he decided to put 3 previously unreleased, never heard by the public before songs on. And one of them was a song that I recorded with him called The Campaigner. And it was an acoustic guitar and vocal song recorded with much the same setup as we used that very first night. And it was a song about Richard Nixon.
Right, I see that.
And it says, even...
What did he do? Was he a musician,
Yeah.
Yeah, it's 6 sides.
President of the United States. So it was a 3-album set.
It's 3 albums? Okay.
Yeah. And out of that 3-album set, there were only...
Do you see on your, I guess you're on your iPad there, do you see where the Campaigner is?
The Campaigners on side 6, it says previously unreleased, right by Love is a Rose, which was also unreleased. So yeah, side 6. And that one included Like a Hurricane, Love is a Rose, Cortez the Killer, Campaigner, and Long May You Run.
Yeah.
Huh?
So really cool. Really cool. Yeah, I'll have to pick this up at some point. 6 sides.
Yeah. And it, so I was quite honored to have one of my songs that I recorded and mixed in my early sessions with Neil appear as one of the 3 previously unreleased songs. Shortly after that,
that's an honor.
It is, Shortly after that, I get the gold record for Decade,
So,
which means that it had sold more than 500,000 copies.
have you ever
And
popped one of those
that,
records out, played it?
oh yeah, we'll talk about that.
Put it on your record player.
Yeah, and it's like
Ever.
Alvin and the Chipmunks.
Yeah,
Or
exactly.
something.
The Moody Blues did that on a number of occasions where we'd pop out the record, and oftentimes it wouldn't even have the same number of tracks as listed. And then shortly after that, I got the platinum album for Decade, which is more than 1,000,000
So
copies.
awesome.
It has since gone on to become multi-platinum, of course.
Right.
And that was Decade. I was, you know, I felt lucky to have become a part of that because, as we've discussed, he had literally hundreds of songs
Mm-hmm.
just begging to be released, and
Yeah,
that was the one chosen.
well, let's move a little bit ahead to you did Hawks and Doves as well, but I want to talk a
I
bit
did
about.
one song each on most of the albums.
Okay.
Most of the albums that he did, as I said, he carried trunkloads of tapes around with him as he toured or as he traveled or whatever he was doing, and he would, go into a studio and try doing something on one or try recording a song, and what happened was he would end up putting songs from various sessions onto albums. It wasn't like most artists who would come in, record a dozen songs, pick their favorite 10 and stamp them onto an album.
Mm-hmm.
He was taking his choice of favorites, and he had hundreds to choose from, and putting them on albums. So on albums like Hawks and Doves, Rust Never Sleeps, he would have chosen one of the songs that I did with him to be on the album. I also worked on the movie soundtrack for Dead Man, which was another thing that was recorded on the beach in a campfire and then released as soundtrack for a movie.
Mm-hmm.
And I did all of the singles mixes for the album Trans,
Right.
which was a monumental, unique album. Nobody who heard it was like, "What on earth is that?" And
The famous vocoder.
and what he did is when he was in Germany, he went into, some guy had come to a concert and he went into his garage and he had all of the leftover Sennheiser vocorders in his garage, and Neil said, "Well, I want to buy them," and made an offer. He was a guy, when he wanted something, he got it,
Sure.
except my spring reverb. And except for that. And he came home with these Sennheiser vocorders, which were the best ones. Everybody thinks that he used a Roland 330 or the Korg or something like that. The album was actually done on the Sennheiser vocorders, which were very tricky to operate, had a zillion controls, a lot of parameters, and he was able to get these unique vocal sounds and vocal harmonies and sweeps and tonalities as you would change the a vocoder works by taking the phonetics of your actual voice and sweeping them with an instrument of tonal quality, so that it had the tone of the instrument and the phonetics of your vocal or whatever else you use. There were albums that I did with Garth Hudson from the band where he used his Korg vocoder. We would record the hi-hat through it, and you'd hear the hi-hat shifting in pitch and going up and down and melodically changing, as the chords would change.
Yeah.
Something I've never heard before.
We did
Well,
that.
the vocoder was sort of resuscitated with that track by Cher. Was it "Believe in Love After Love"? That's a vocoder. If you're not
Yeah.
associated with how
You
Neil
used to
Young.
have that single, didn't you?
Yeah, I listened to that one frequently.
So
Not
with
quite, but that's just like in
yeah,
more modern music where you're like, oh, the vocoder, there it is again, you know.
Yeah.
And Neil Young, like if you're thinking about what kind of sound is Richard talking about with Neil Young, one of the more famous songs from that is a song called "Sample and Hold"
Oh
from the
yeah.
record Trans, and it sounds like the voice is a robot, and
Robot.
and it was originally
Must kill.
created. See, it's interesting because Richard was talking about it being picked up in Germany because I think the Nazis used it to mask voices so that
that's what it was invented for, supposedly. I
you
don't
couldn't
know.
understand what they were
Space
saying.
Nazis?
Well,
Nazis from outer space?
Just so you didn't know who was talking.
who was talking? Yeah,
They
you
would
right,
impart a tonality over it, so you
right.
didn't know who or what was, but you could understand the words, just like
I
on
don't know if
trans
that's
you can
true.
understand the words.
Right. I
Right.
don't know if that's true or not.
I think that I was told that's what it was invented for, but I don't know that it was ever used for, as was a lot of recording equipment invented for World War II
Right.
to deceive the public.
Absolutely.
And on the Trans album, Neil had gone on tour to, I believe, Europe, and David phones me up and says, I got to get in the studio. We're going to mix the singles for the Trans album. And I didn't go on the tour with Neil like I usually do, so we're going to spend the time mixing, book us out a big span of time because this is not going to go quick. And they brought in two 16-track machines. I talked about on how on Ragged Glory they use two digital 24-track machines. Actually, the first digital machines of any kind of quality to ever come out. But on this, they use two 16-track Ampex machines that were linked together with what we call a Q-lock, which was one of the early machines used for syncing tape machines. It was a terrible English-made device that was very prone to failure, was very complicated and intricate in its circuitry, and you would record, you'd have to give up 2 tracks out of the 16, one as a buffer track between the recorded music, the 14 tracks, 1 through 14 of music, then a buffer track, and then track 16 was a SMPTE track.
Right,
You had to leave. You
Yep.
had to leave the buffer so that you couldn't hear the SMPTE bleeding into the track next to it, which on a tape machine, there was always some degree of bleed between the adjacent tracks. So what we basically had was two 14-track machines, a total of 28 tracks, with this device syncing them together. And the Ampex machines, we had to rent them because Indigo had a 24-track machine, and we did have 16-track capabilities, but we didn't have 2 of them. So they said, well, let's keep it on the original machines. Let's get 2 16-track Ampex machines and a Q-lock and keep everything like it was. And I remember at one point, something went wrong in the Q-lock, and one of the machines, one of the motors went into rewind and the other one was still playing.
Oh no.
And it
wow.
stretched the tape beyond repair.
Yeah.
Oh
yeah.
Literally made it into like shredded egg, where the edges were like linguine noodles cut with a pair of pinking shears, and we had to find a place where we could make a copy. Fortunately, it was in a part of the song that happened more than once, and we were able to cover up this blemish by using the other spot in the song where the same part of the chorus happened.
Well,
Nobody ever knew that this happened. I don't know that.
Now they do.
I mean, I might be exposing this even to some people in the Neil Young camp, but we shredded the tape and put it back together and made a seamless mix of the song. The primary songs that we mixed were Mr. Soul and Sample and Hold. Sample and Hold was later disclosed to me by David Briggs as being Neil's all-time favorite mix of something that he had done ever, and was often played in his studio up in Redwood City, and was just waiting for a place to have a home. I don't know if it's ever been released. I don't think it has yet. But that, except as a single, you can look on YouTube and you will see Sample and Hold single version and be able to play it. But we did a lot of effects on that. It was a very long version of the song. We had, I think, 200 takes of the mix, which we then spliced together, 2 bars from here and a chorus from there and another 4 bars from, mix number 68 and another 3 bars from mix number 21 and then on to a bridge from mix number 201 and so forth, and made the final mix that came out as the single. And it was a real work of art when we finally finished up on that song. And it took weeks to do at an enormous budget. So it was probably one of the more expensive songs ever mixed. But in my opinion, one of the best pieces of music I've ever heard. Mm-hmm. So if you get a chance, listen to it. It is there. It's not in the extreme quality that we had in the studio, because it's been compressed and fiddled with before it went to YouTube. But an unbelievable work of art. And Neil very much appreciated it.
One thing I'd like to bring up too, because we've gotten into a lot of the technical side today, is when I was growing up, when I was a kid, grunge was in, and I didn't realize how much of an influence Neil Young had on him, because I listened to Pearl Jam and stuff, and they would do F and Up and some other songs, and I didn't really realize, I listened to grunge before I ever listened to Neil Young, and then I was like, oh, I see the connection. Yeah. But that's my generation.
He even did some album work up in Seattle, which was sort of the home to grunge, and then brought them down, and I was able to work on some of those grunge numbers. He brought a bit of grunge into Ragged Glory. He brought a bit of grunge into a lot of tracks that he did, but basically grunge took from him rather than him taking from grunge.
Yeah, they all cite him as a major influence.
Of course, and I didn't realize that as a kid, but years later. Also, after moving out to LA, I go to a lot of open mic nights because, I love indie musicians, so I love going out and seeing what's going on. And I've noticed that a lot of the 50, 60-year-old range, these guys sound, they'll do like a Neil Young song, and then they'll do one of their own, and it sounds just like Neil Young.
Well, gee, I wonder why.
The influence is so huge that there'll be 3 guys at open mic night, and all of them sound just like Neil Young.
Right.
And I don't know
interestingly, though, his guitar sound was virtually unobtainable by anybody else. He would always have a Fender Tweed, his own personal Fender Tweed, for his electric, and that's what you'd see on stage. And then sort of behind the wall of stuff would be his Baldwin guitar amp, not made for a guitar amp, made as an organ amp. Huge set of tubes. I think it had 16 speakers and was this monster. And that was the real Neil Young guitar sound, even though he would have that Tweed amp out for visibility, and nobody would ever know where that enormous sound was coming from.
Right. Yeah, backstage secret touch.
That big Baldwin organ setup used, that had one of his techs had designed an input to it so that it would take his guitar rather than an organ. Because most of those old organ amps, like the reason that I held up that Leslie combo is you couldn't just plug into a Leslie without that. You needed some sort of interface.
Yep.
And the same went for Baldwin. He had to make something that would allow him to plug his guitar into it, and that was his signature sound.
Yeah, what
Right.
you see on stage is quite different sometimes, because a friend of mine, Matt Starr, he plays drums with Ace Frehley, and he sent me some pictures, and I was like looking on there, and the Ace Frehley setup is like all these 4x12 Marshall cabinets, like the old Kiss style, but I bet not one of those are really
It's
working.
running.
Yeah,
Yeah,
there's
no,
only
none of-
one
they're
little
called-
amp backstage.
Yeah, they're called dummy cabinets.
Yeah,
fairly,
it's just-
it's fairly common. It's,
Yeah.
In
It's
fact,
just
most of the
funny.
companies even sell dummy cabinets for that particular use on stage.
yeah.
If they have a band that they're endorsing and they want a wall of Marshalls or
Mhm.
a wall of Mesas or a wall of whatever it is on stage, they make dummy cabinets for the band. And generally,
Here's how you'll
some,
know.
some bands actually did use a whole wall
Well,
of
here's how
amps,
you.
but most of them not.
If you're watching a band live on YouTube or whatever, and you're curious as to what Derek and Richard are talking about, here's how you can tell what amp is actually being used.
They're not mic'd.
It's got a microphone.
Yeah.
It's got a microphone
yeah.
in front of it.
It's just a
Indeed.
wall of
That
amps,
one,
and none of
the
them are
one that
mic'd.
has a little tiny microphone somewhere clipped on it or in front of it, is
That one's
actually
mic'd,
being used.
Yes,
Everything else.
That in
is-
police work is what we call a clue. You know, as
Fingerprints.
to
photo
what's
analysis.
actually making the sound that the audience is hearing.
Everything
Seriously.
else, especially on, like we were talking about with the heavy metal bands, you'll see what are called, heads and cabs, and they're all stacked. And Kiss was, as you said, was one of the forefathers.
That
Yeah,
would kill the
forefathers.
fans if all those were on.
They're
would
all
never hear
they're all
again.
empty, and even the heads, they might
Mhm.
have a light on it, and so you think that it's
Nothing
got power,
going on.
but it's just a light. There's nothing in that head because it's too expensive to have it.
Actually, the expense wasn't the real driving cause. Most of those big bands could well afford to
Yeah, that's
put
true.
$20,000 worth of amps on stage.
Right.
What it was is that if you had that many guitar amps blazing away on stage, you'd never hear the vocalist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No matter how
Anything.
close he got to the mic, what you'd hear would be this enormous wall of guitars and a vocalist screaming his head off to barely be
Please
heard.
hear me.
Because you can't scream as loud as all those guitar amps would be,
Yeah.
or all those bass amps, or something like that. I think we
No,
froze.
it's still done today.
Have we frozen on your screen?
No, nobody's
I'm
frozen.
good. I see you guys.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just fine.
It's still done today. I think I saw either a photo on a bulletin board or something where a couple of sort of hard rock bands like Black Veil Brides and all that got caught with dummy cabinets, and
Sure.
and everybody was kind of like, "Oh my God, dummy cabinets!" And it's
Are you
like that's been
surprised?
going on. It's been going on for years and years and years. Eddie Van Halen,
Oh yeah. Yeah.
he only used one amp.
It's part of the show.
It's part of the show.
That's all it is.
One thing I wanted to close off with was a little known set of facts about the Trans album, which led to what was called the Trans Tour. Now, the Trans Tour was based on the Trans album, complete with vocorders and all the incredibly fancy computer age songs. And there are several different versions of the Trans Tour. We went to YouTube earlier and saw several incarnations of the Trans Tour,
Yeah.
but I remember we only found one, which was the way that I remembered it being, and for which I, with David Briggs, prepared some tapes. And I believe, wasn't that one that was in Germany, Stephen?
Yeah.
And
There was
most-
I can't remember which track it was. Maybe it was Sample and Hold, or
It was.
where
Or Mr.
literally
Stone.
it's just him on stage without the band and the backing tapes, and he begins to play and sing the track with the vocoder, and
And there's nobody else on stage.
there's nobody
with
else
him.
on stage. Yeah, it's just him and
And that's how the original tour was. I remember seeing it in Los Angeles, and before the tour, they came into the studio. If you'll notice at the beginning of that one YouTube video, which I think is the best portrayal of the whole tour, it shows an actual reel of Ampex tape spinning around. And that picture was taken from the control booth. Now, you don't, you normally associate that with something like the Liza Minnelli or something like that, where they're singing to something that's pre-recorded.
Well, no, nowadays the pre-recording is the singing too.
Yeah, oftentimes. And
so.
what happened in this case was it was virtually impossible to duplicate many of the effects live on a tour.
Mm-hmm.
So we took a 16-track tape and put some of the more difficult things to reproduce on it. And Neil would start each song off in a fashion that people were beginning to accept, that you could create a track in what was called MIDI, musical interface, digital interface. And
one more time.
Musical instrument digital interface.
And you could quickly do that. So what Neil did is gave the false perception of him creating the track on stage in a matter of moments. He would start off by going over to a set of electronic drums known as Simmons drums, and he would boom, 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 give a heartbeat kick drum, and then he'd step on this big red button, and then that kick drum would keep playing back. And then he'd go over and he'd hit the snare every other beat to it, and hit the red button, and the snare would play back. And then he'd go over and he'd do a tom fill on the Simmons drums, and at the end of every verse or chorus, wherever that tom was playing on the original song, that would appear. And people thought he was actually, in a matter of less than a minute, creating the track. And then he'd go over and he'd play the bass for 15 seconds, a bass riff, which was the root of the song, and he'd press the red button, and the bass would start playing back with it, and so on for other instruments. And as such, people thought that he was creating the song, when in fact, in the booth, there was a tape machine running with all those instruments already pre-recorded on them, because you couldn't, with different sections of a song, in that amount of time, create a verse, a chorus, a bridge, a solo, etc. But he gave the illusion that he was doing that. And this is in the tour where it was just him by himself with a guitar. Now, he had a headset on, so he was actually playing a guitar that was heard by the audience, and he was actually singing the lead vocal part through his headset. But you'd always wonder, how is it that there's 16 vocals all of a sudden as backing vocals? And how could one person sing so many parts when there's only one guy on stage? And the secret of it was these tapes that David Briggs and I manufactured to give credence to the illusion that he had created the track in a matter of seconds, so as not to bore the audience with how long it actually would take to make a real MIDI sequence track. And then he would go along and play it. And that one video is the only one that we were able to find that shows that actual tape machine spinning and one guy on stage doing the work of many. But that's how the trance show that I was invited to after making the tape actually went on. Cool. So that's kind of a little known fact about one of my absolute all-time world favorite artists that I ever worked with, Neil Young, and David Briggs, beloved producer. David was a guy that knew how to get what he wanted. And sometimes he would do it by being abrasive and literally scaring the artist into getting what he needed. Sometimes he'd do it by being complimentary and getting the artist to feel real good about themselves. But he knew what it would take to create the tension necessary in the studio to get what he wanted on tape. And that's why his sessions with Neil, he was the only guy that ever would do the kind of things that he did with Neil. He was the only guy that would do the kind of things that he would do with other artists that I worked on him with. And Neil is, to this day, I think, one of the most amazing and landmark artists ever to hit.
Yeah.
People would complain that, oh, he sings out of tune and he can't play the guitar and blah, 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 blah. I remember there was one Canadian critic who said, you know, listen to this album. What a catastrophe. He can't sing on pitch and stuff. And Neil's answer on television was, what's this guy thinking? He says, I've sang this song 100 times on stage. It's the same out-of-tune part in every version of it. That's the way I intend it to be. I don't think that everything being on a grid to perfect time and pitch is the way a song should be. It has to have some feel, and I'm able to duplicate that feel. It's the way I want it to be. So Neil could sing in perfect pitch if he wanted to, but he would use that tool of pitchiness to create the tension necessary for a song, and he's the only guy I've ever known who could constantly duplicate it so that it would come out that way every time he played it.
There's another thing I just wanted to present to the listeners on this podcast, and we're gonna talk about it more in earnest. But I've been proposing with Richard and Derek that we create a listening service for musicians out there that would pay a service fee to have a track listened to and commented on by Richard Kaplan and other engineers that we know in this community. And if that's something that you are listening to this podcast and you're a musician or even an engineer or a producer or a rapper, we don't care the genre, we don't even care if the music is in the English language, and you want to have a track critiqued by Richard, let us know, because we're in the process of starting that service for I mean, the whole beauty of it is, as Derek and I were talking about, is that if you're a person, say, for example, in a town in Missouri, and you might not have access to a pair of ears like Richard's, and the same person that recorded Neil Young and Korn and Limp Bizkit and Slipknot, and what does he think of your song? What does he think of your songwriting? Also, what does he think of your production skills? You know, those are the main three facets that the song would be listened to on. That would be production, songwriting, and performance. Mm-hmm. And nobody's expecting it to be perfect, but somebody like Richard and ourselves, but we kind of understand that you probably want Richard to hear it, can sit down and listen to you and tell you how you might be able to improve your song. And
right.
we're going to launch that in the very near future.
Yeah. But more about that is as it reveals itself, because I think we have a good start, and I think we have some good people behind us.
Right.
And I believe it'll be a good service for anybody and everybody. And I have a lot of faith in it. But let's save that until a later date.
Yeah. I just wanted to make that announcement.
Yeah.
And if we choose to edit that out, fine. But I still I still think it's an idea that we've been working on, and of course Richard's on board, and we're excited about the prospect of getting people that might not be in LA to have your music heard.
Seriously.
So that being said, this wraps up our first of Neil Young podcast. Again, you can reach us on facebook.com/StudioRatHQ, and if you hear the podcast and are at least interested in the music service, send us a message there. Also, you can listen to this podcast on StudioRatHQ.com and iTunes as well. Just type in Studio Rat HQ, 3 separate words. The website is 1 word. And here on YouTube, all of our videos are available at youtube.com/StudioRatHQ.
Studio Rat HQ on every other site except iTunes is 1 word, right. StudioRatHQ.
Right.
Yep,
And there are some instructional videos on there
We're
teaching
still
you.
making more of those, yeah.
Yep.
You guys
How
make
Richard uses things like a limiter, like a Teletronics compressor limiter, about how to mic drums, how to mic guitar amps, showing you his techniques so that if you are a major studio owner or a home studio owner and you're just interested in hearing other people how they do it, it's available for you. So my name again is Stephen Couch, and I'm here with Richard Kaplan and Derek Jablonski. And as usual, same rat time, same rat channel. And we'll talk to you again. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.